Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to The Authority File, you can listen to and find previous episodes on all of the major podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and on our website, choice360.org. My guest for this series is Michelle Porter. Michelle is an author, poet, and postdoc fellow at the University of Toronto, where she's pursuing a unique blending of her research and creative output. Her book, due out this month from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, is called Scratching River. It's a memoir that's part poetry and part nonfiction, but it's all based on family, one's sense of place, and on Michelle's Métis ancestry, a First Nations group of mixed European and Indigenous roots. In this series, which is provided with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, Michelle and I discuss her research background and the process of writing her book, Scratching River. In this third episode, we look more closely at Michelle's writing style, including the way she blends primary source research, her family's perspectives, and her own narrative voice. After your first book of poetry, Inquiries, came out, you did a couple interviews in which you talked about how you merge nonfiction and poetry. Did you approach this book, Scratching River, in a similar fashion? How does that incorporate your writing styles?
Yeah.
I guess can you talk a little bit more of what we call creative nonfiction?
I love the playground of creative nonfiction because anything is possible. I have been able to bring my poetry into it, even a fictional or prose approach to it, bringing the research into it, and tell it all crooked, as I like to say. So there's poetry in this book, and there's that poetic engagement with research, poetic engagement with the truth. Very, very strongly that fusing of those two things is in my engagement with the river. And there's something very poetic within academic language. In research reports and articles often hides the poetry, but I find it and I pull it out. So I fell in love with a lot of the terminology within descriptions of river morphology, river processes, rivers that braid and that run dry in places and that flood and rise again. And not only did I fall in love with the language, but I fall in love with what the river itself is teaching me about, how to approach trauma, how to approach just life in general.
Mm-hmm.
So I very directly find it very inspiring. I very directly engage in research and engage with other people's research to bring to find that poetry, to cut away some of the typical academic, the methods description, and bring the poetry out into it. And I've braided multiple strands of that together so that the meanings echo off of each other, and that every reader would likely read this book and bring out of it slightly different understanding and meaning, which to me is the point and is beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's perfectly segues into this next question, which is, and you just mentioned the importance of getting at the truth, which is obviously important in nonfiction, but also in the artistic approach too. There are truths there that people go for, and you've talked prior to this conversation about a quote closer engagement to the truth as a writing style for you, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and as you just mentioned, what does that require of the reader, and how are they rewarded by that approach?
Yeah, I've in writing Scratching River, I could have written it so many different ways. Now, if I'd written a book as a linear play-by-play of what happened, I wouldn't have written the truth of it. And I wouldn't have written what that 14-year-old girl had to tell. And I wouldn't have written what I learned from my brother, which are, in this case, very important truths that need to be part of the story. I'd have written a timeline with a bit of extended, commentary on it, which, I would have written a journalistic account, which is very necessary, and a style that's, good, and certainly has a wonderful place in our reading and writing.
Right.
But the truth of of the stories that I'm telling is much greater than the details. And in a certain way, I didn't write the details of what happened to my brother. There's a couple of reasons for that, but one of them is I didn't want to reiterate or expand upon the violence of what happened to him.
Hmm.
So I include excerpts from newspaper stories, because what happened to my brother made it into the newspapers for quite some time and was quite
Okay.
controversial in both the government's response and that. And I didn't feel like I had any. I felt like including those excerpts was powerful in itself, and that some of the objectivity eludes the truth in the sense of the impact it has upon people and families.
Right.
So it's both the meaning we make up of a story like this and its impact, and that is in the work that I do better achieved by bringing the reader through an emotional process, bringing the reader to a greater meaning of the story that journalism doesn't really bring to it. And yet journalism has a piece in the story,
Hmm.
and the almost cold objectivity in the news stories, I think, tell the story as well.
Yeah.
Because off of the conversations I'm having with my family about the incident, and it, it's very removed, and it's very and the sense of frustration and difficulty that we weren't able to find justice for my brother in that, in a real sense, and that there isn't more monitoring for homes like these, and there isn't more ways to guarantee safety
Mhm.
when housing people who are the most vulnerable. You know, that that appears in those news stories, although it isn't. It appears in, it isn't directly said in all of them.
Right. Yeah, I suppose the journalistic approach does leave a whole lot of room for the reader to react in the way they want to react to the coldness of the facts. But then there's, as you say, there's another truth. There's the truth of how these things actually impacted your brother and the people close to him. And
And the truth of trauma isn't told in facts,
right.
because people respond so differently to trauma, and across time, trauma impacts different people so differently, and the healing process, I think, is so amazing that I that the truth of just showing that, that emotional coming apart and coming back together, that emotional river braiding is so powerful. I know that at different points in my life, it's in reading other people's very raw descriptions, in a sense of very raw engagement, creative engagement with, their own traumas. It's been very, very powerful and very inspiring to me personally.
Mhm.
So
Right. You've talked quite a bit now about sort of the relationship you had with your 14-year-old self, or that you kind of rediscovered or discovered as you got further into the writing of Scratching River. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how those two perspectives, your adult self and your 14-year-old self, maybe challenged you as you wrote the book. And to the extent that you can, can you talk a little bit about what you discovered you needed to reconcile as you dealt with that?
well, it's you know trauma. The funny thing about trauma is that whenever it hits it, if it isn't processed, there's that part of you that's always at that age. So if you eh, it can be sort of hidden
Mm.
until it's triggered, but it's there, and it's subtly shaping a worldview. So that 14-year-old girl that sat down beside me and said, it's time now to tell that story. I was viewing the world very, very, from two sets of eyes.
Yep.
very much. But I hadn't yet developed that healed, that other side of this trauma pair of eyes. So when I was writing it down, when I was writing the story of recalling and the conversation with my sister and my mother, it was very, very much I let that 14-year-old lead. So the story is told very much from that emotional landscape of that 14-year-old for whom these kind of events are world transforming the way you see the world. So it came out in some ways. It came out as very it can come out as very raw
Hmm.
and a very raw emotional flow of the events and the rememberings. And I felt like I wanted to honor that part of the healing process was honoring that 14-year-old point of view, but also that it's an unusual point of view that, so much of what we read about trauma is actually written from that adult point of view, looking
Yes.
back.
Hmm.
And we lose so many details when we do that because our memories of trauma, once we've healed, and I've discovered this, once you've done that, you've gotten to the other side and you've healed, you do not really remember. I would read some of it and think, oh, maybe there's that positive worldview. There's that sense that things are going to turn out well, so you lose some of what it really felt like to be there,
Mm.
and you color it. So you color it up as well based on feeling good at the end. But that's not what it's like when you're there. So if you're writing, if you're writing that truth, when I came to the editing portion, I had a decision. Do I want to change this narrator? Do I want to make this narrator the one who's been through it and recovered, or the one who's going through it and gets to a place of recovery?
Mm.
So that's and I to honor that 14-year-old in that story, and in also honor of the other people I know who have told stories like that I have found so compelling and so unusual and healing. I stayed with that point of view. I found it difficult to edit because my perspective had shifted so significantly when
Yeah.
at the end of that I couldn't get back into that 14-year-old voice. I couldn't write this book again today at
Mm.
all. So when you read this book, you're writing something that I could have only written uh, in a very short period of time when I was honestly, naturally responding to and exploring this trauma and the story of this 14-year-old girl, and she's in so many ways she's released, she's moved on, and I am much more the adult, and I don't have a 14-year-old sitting down beside me anymore.
Right.
So,
That's amazing. You mentioned, choosing your narrative voice, and just expanding on that a little bit. Can you talk about the balance of incorporating primary sources and your family's perspectives while also maintaining that narrative voice that you landed on?
yeah. Yeah, so a lot of this, I mean, the majority of this book, one of the original drafts of this book was very much written like a script because um, so much, one of the early drafts, because so much of it was actually based on my conversations with my sister and my mother, and interviews with people. So this book, although in its final draft, some of the research, unlike academic research papers where you put the research right up front and tell them exactly what you did and how you did it,
Yeah.
this one it's not so obvious. But the conversations with my mother, very much, my mother, I love her storytelling technique. I love the way she speaks about the world. Much of even the diction is remains my mother's.
Mm.
Now, when I and it's very much based on conversations I actually had with my mother and recorded, as well with my sister. I have an MA in folklore, and I love working with oral history because I find the way people speak, the way they remember, and the meaning of how they remember. I find that so endlessly fascinating, and I stayed with that here, even with doing an interview with some of the people my brother worked with at the end. So everything in this book is, held up, substantiated. Its foundation is research or interview that I have done with somebody. Every part that I wrote, because there's the newspaper excerpts in there, and the process of moving parts of it into my voice, which is, I followed very much poetic. If you, some of the style here, if you read my book of poetry inquiries, you would even recognize even the way some of the sections start very direct, giving that person their voice right away. But that's also my voice, which is listening to other people and putting that onto the page.
You just heard from Michelle Porter, an author, poet, and postdoc fellow at the University of Toronto. Michelle's first book of poetry, Inquiries, was shortlisted for the Pat Lowther Memorial Award in 2019 and was a finalist for the E.J. Pratt Poetry Award in 2021. Her memoir, Scratching River, is due out this month from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week as we discuss the unique ways in which Michelle structured her book, including the use of experimental storytelling, the relationship of the physical landscape to her writing, and how she constructed one of the most interesting bibliographies I've ever seen.
Part of what I disliked about the bibliography is that it leaves out so much more than I could say, and it felt so partial and so, in some ways, the traditional bibliography, when you're working within the Métis context, where the only people I was going to be able to thank openly or to recognize how they contributed to my base of knowledge were going to be other academics. That felt so wrong because this book was built even much more so on my mother's knowledge, my grandmother's knowledge, my grandfather's knowledge, the knowledge that my brother taught me, somebody whose way of teaching and being would never be recognized in a traditional academic bibliography.
As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.